Okay, thanks a lot for coming today to the Authors at Google event. Today we have Fred Dust. If you are here for the Fred Durst talk, now's your chance to leave. We're sorry. Mr. Durst will be here in the future, hopefully. But Fred Dust is actually a more important and more interesting speaker, and so we're in for quite a treat. He leads the Smart Space Design practice for IDEO from their San Francisco office, and he's an architect by training, leading multidisciplinary teams to creative, immersive, interactive spaces for a number of industries, including healthcare, education, retail, finance, and others. If you're not familiar with IDEO, they're a company you should look into because they're a design consultancy with offices around the world, not just in North America, and they help design products, services, environments, and digital experiences. And IDEO kind of first hit my radar about 10 years ago when I was at Fast Company magazine, and they're consistently interesting. Almost every project they do is worth looking at and learning from. The project we'll learn about today is a travel book, but it is unlike any travel book I've ever seen. Published by Chronicle Books in San Francisco, which has a great book design kind of approach. It re-envisions and kind of just reimagines what a travel guide could be, looking at our city, New York City. And so we invited Fred here today to talk to us about the book, his work at IDEO, and other related topics. Please welcome Fred Dust.
Thanks. It's funny, I get the Fred Durst joke all the time, but mostly from hotels. Like, hotels are freaked out that it's like Fred Durst staying there. So they're always like, they're afraid that I'm going to bust up the room. So I have to kind of talk them down and like, I really am not Fred Durst. But thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here. I'm going to chat. I thought it wouldn't just be interesting just to talk about the book itself, because I'll definitely go through content, but it's always hard to talk about New York to people who live in New York. So that's part of why this actually is interesting to me, and I'll tell you some terrifying stories about that. But what I thought I'd do is talk a little about IDEO, the book, why we did it, kind of what we mean by it, and kind of in that point I'll kind of take you through some of the content, and then some of the things we've learned. And I kind of thought about things that we've learned that I thought would be specifically interesting to you based on the world that you live in, because frankly there's a lot of questions now about why even do a travel book, and I think there's some interesting things for us all to talk about potentially afterwards. So with that, a little bit about IDEO. We're a design company, design strategy firm. A lot of what we get asked is the question that's up here: what's the blank of the future? People don't come to us when they know exactly what they want. They come to us when they don't know what they want, when there's something different. And we've worked in I don't know, hundreds of industries across amazing kinds of project spectrum for about 30 years. And we basically do the same thing with all the projects that we do, which is that we believe that the most important thing to get at really interesting design insights is to have a multidisciplinary approach. So IDEO is about 600 people. There's a percentage of that group that's our sociologists, anthropologists, psychologists, architects, graphic designers, communications people, writers, business people. The whole idea behind IDEO is to have a bunch of different people out in the world looking at your design problem and doing it from their perspective. And just the background of some of this stuff, and I chose one or two things that were New York based. We actually, one of the things that we had sort of a dubious mark of fame was a project we did for Prada here in Soho that was about redoing the dressing rooms. I don't know if anyone's been to the dressing rooms in Prada, but what's amazing about the dressing rooms, well, we did a ton of stuff. This is the thing that was the most amazing, was that the mirrors allow you to like see what your ass looks like while you're turning around. So you can basically see yourself from the front and the back and everything you're wearing. And what's amazing is that people will spend hours in that dressing room just turning around and around and around. So it's actually pretty, it's a funny kind of small design that's actually had a strangely big impact in the store experience there. We work a lot in hospitality, and what's interesting about that is from high end to low end. So it's as likely that we'll have a team out in Kansas trying to figure out what breakfast means for someone who drives all day and is staying at a hotel one night, as it is we'll have somebody in Barcelona trying to figure out what cocktail hour means in Barcelona. So literally we're out there kind of trying to experience the world from multiple different perspectives based on the needs of our clients. And a funny thing has started to happen like in the last couple of years, and this is sort of what I see as the beginning of it, which was that about 4 years ago we had the secretary of the prime minister of Finland called and was basically saying, we'd love to talk to you about how you think about design process and Finland and the way it would relate. And what we did was bring them to San Francisco and took them out for a walk around San Francisco to understand social issues firsthand, and from that begin to think about how you might actually have that impact parliamentary procedure. That actually surprisingly became an interesting offer. And over the years, what we got were clients coming to us saying, I'm going to be in New York, can you take us shopping for an afternoon? And what was interesting is that what we realized is we take a client like Gap or Nike or anyone out shopping, is that what we were looking for in shopping was different from what they were looking for. So often what they were looking for were really inspiring visuals, things that actually seemed like they were really different in the way stores looked often. What we were interested in were the way stores acted. And so I have a funny experience where we had a client here and we were shopping around and we took them to the Soho Apple store. And they were like, okay, well, we know the Apple store, it's pretty, da da da. And we're like, yeah, no, we know the Apple store too, but we were there at lunch. We were like, watch the behaviors in the Apple store at the Soho Apple store at lunch. And what was amazing is when you started watching, you started seeing really interesting things happen. You saw people having lunch, people obviously surfing and doing their own work, people picking each other up, people having picnic lunches so they'd have their whole family while they were waiting to have their computer fixed. And you started seeing behaviors that made the store act a lot less like a store and a lot more like a public park. And those are the things that we thought were really interesting. And those are the things that we thought could have benefit as we started talking to our clients. And it morphed into all kinds of crazy things like I took a major CEO moisturizer shopping because he'd never bought moisturizer before. So it gets a little funny at times, but basically we began to take people out into the world. And that sort of inspired an idea for us, which is that we were getting so many requests, and we were getting requests specifically around New York, Los Angeles, and London, where people were going and saying, we're going to go to these locations. Can you tell us if there were 10 places, where should we go? That we said, well, what if we chose 50? And what if we published it? So we basically looked out of the world of travel guides, tried to figure out what was interesting about travel guides, what wasn't. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. And then created this concept of saying, what if we chose 50 locations in any city that we thought would give people insight not only into what gets made in those cities, but actually about the city themselves. So one of my favorite, when you write a book like this, you start seeing, there's all these reviews, but the greatest ones are the Amazon.com reviews, because they're the most terrifying, because they're just like random whoever in the world. And one of my favorite reviews is from Amazon where someone said, this book seems like it's anthropology light. And that's not the way we conceived it, but in fact, that's the way it acts, and that's the way we like to talk about it now, is that it's sort of like anthropology light. Hopefully what we choose allows you to see a little bit more into the cities you live in or the cities you go to and what the people in those cities do. There's two, New York and London, and there's talks about more, which we'll chat about later. But what I thought I'd do is kind of quickly go through a couple of themes in the book and show you some of the examples that we chose and why. And so if you have the book, you can kind of page along. But if you look, one of the things that we did is we organized the book by 4 types. Mingler, shopper, like basically saying there are ways that you like to approach a city. There's some people who like to shop their way through a city, and that's as good a way to see a city as eating your way through a city. It's just your own perspective on how you like to deal with the city. And we also, from that, pulled out pages that were themes. Here are big themes that we're seeing that kind of relate across almost all the experiences that we chose. So what I thought I'd do is walk through some of the themes and then kind of talk about the examples that we chose. And I'd be really curious as we go to just hear if there's places that people have been or just other places that are like this, or certainly we can talk about it afterwards. So some things to look for. One of the first themes that I think is actually it's quintessentially New York. In fact, it's more New York than any other city we've been in, which is when you ask people where to go, people don't want to tell you. It's like, unless you already know. And what's really funny about New York is that basically people kind of get to know each other by the places that they know in common. We had a really strange experience one night where we were trying to find the best local bar, which is really hard in New York. And we'd met this couple and they were on their first date. They had just met each other and they were like, we're going to drive you around. It was like an ad exec and like a carpenter, which is typical New York combo also. And it's like, we'll drive you around till you find the perfect place. And so they were driving us around and they were arguing about what the perfect place was. And you realize that as they began to realize that they knew the same places that other people didn't know, they were totally falling in love with each other. It was actually really great. So if they get married, we totally deserve an invite to the wedding. So So just a couple examples. This is this place called Breakbeat Science. Has anyone been to Breakbeat Science? I actually don't know if Breakbeat Science is still there. That's how secret it is. Every time somebody goes to find it, they're like, I think it's not there anymore. And I'm like, I know, I looked for it for a year before I found it. But what's funny about Breakbeat Science is it used to be basically a homespun record label and kind of a mecca for local DJs on the Lower East Side. And it had its whole space, basically, this big storefront. When we were looking for it, we could not find it. And we walked by the address 1,000 times. And finally, we went into this clothing store that was there, and which is I think called BB Blessing. And we basically, it's like when you walk into a store and you're like feeling already embarrassed because like it's way too cool for you. And you like walk in and you're like, we're looking for this place called Breakbeat Science. And they're like, oh yeah, it's back there. And we're like, what? And they're like, it's back there. And literally they walk us to the back and there's a shelf of records and you move the shelf of records, which is a door, and there's a tiny closet with the record store in there. It's like this small thing. Literally, and so that's why I laugh, is that when we send people back, people are like, it's not there anymore. And I'm like, it probably is. It's just that you didn't go back far enough. But these kinds of secrets really matter in New York. And they're kind of the core of your currency. Like whenever now I actually talk to people in New York, they're like, I have a place that I want to tell you about as long as you don't put it in the book. It's like the classic thing that people talk about. So much so that the mythologies get crazy. This is a place called Tsukushi, and the reason I tell this story is that Tsukushi, when I heard about it, was like, it's a Japanese restaurant that only serves you what they want to serve you, and you have to go through a Mexican restaurant that's behind Penn Station into the back kitchen, ask for it, they'll take you downstairs, and it's downstairs. So Tsukushi is on the street. It's got its own address. It's like, just so you know. But what was so funny is that so much was invested in making sure it was secret that story they told was even more crazy, even more secretive than you could even imagine. It's still an amazing place, but the reason we liked it is that it was a great example of how the mythology of secrecy mattered more even than how secret it was. I put this one in because, specifically from an IDEO experience, we call this greening of New York City. And the reason I think it's funny is that about 6 years ago, we did a project called Green Hunting in New York City, where we basically took a bunch of people green hunting. And we said, go out and look for examples of the way the city is green, look for sustainability, look for the ways these things happen. It was kind of at the same time that the Christo gates were up. So it was actually kind of as part of a big conference that was going on. Nobody could find anything. Like literally they went out and everybody came back with Whole Foods. That was because there was Whole Foods right close to the park, and they're like, Whole Foods? And we're like, okay, after a while Whole Foods doesn't count. But it's like, but basically, and what's funny is that everybody thinks Whole Foods is from New York. We're like, it's not even from New York. But it's like, what's funny though is that we really couldn't find green in the city. And that's changed really radically. You can find it in experiences. So this is Build a Green Bakery, which is actually not that far from here, if you guys get a chance to go. And what's amazing about it is that it has, it's all built out of recycled materials, everything in the place. But what's really cool is the service component. So they do things like if you skateboard up, they'll take a discount off of anything that you buy. So anything like with any time that you show that you're not driving, and they basically kind of do a sliding scale of discount based on how much consumption you had. So it's like, it's a really, really interesting example of kind of the greening of experiences. But I had a really funny experience while we were doing the book, which is that we were in Bryant Park, and there was a bunch of posters along the big green there that basically talk about why lawns are good for the world, which, by the way, is highly suspect, and we have no idea whether we know whether the lawns are good for the world or bad. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that maybe lawns are really bad. But what was funny to me is that suddenly this notion that green was so important that they were going to take things that had always existed and retell it with a green story. And so I think in a lot of this stuff, we're beginning to see the notion of greenwashing come forward, and we know it's a really interesting thing to watch in New York as we go forward in this administration. So just an interesting sideline topic. You can't talk about New York without talking about big ideas in little spaces. I was walking over here and I passed by a cafe, and there was this great sign. I took a photo of it, and it basically said, more fun and bigger than your living room if you have a living room, was what the sign outside the cafe. And really, we look for certain kinds of constraints as designers that we think set the ways we think as people in cities, and this is one of them. space and the way you respond to space means everything. And anytime you're at a dinner party, anytime you're any place, people will want to talk about the creative ways they were able to work around how small their spaces were. You guys are quite luxurious here. You have more space than like I've ever seen in New York. But what's interesting for you even to think about is, why does Google decide to do that? Partially, it's probably because it makes this place a lot more comfortable than a lot of your homes, based on the fact that where you live. The reality is space constraints set the ways for the way New Yorkers think and way smart businesses might think as well. So just a couple examples. Odd things in interesting places. I don't know if anyone's seen the Earth Room. This is in Soho. This has been around since like the early 70s. It's a sculpture by Walter de Maria, and it's a gallery filled with about 3 feet of Earth. And it's been there. What I love about it is that I remember seeing it when I was a kid, and like it's still there, and it's like in the exact same place. And now it's in the most expensive real estate in the city. Then it was like the cheapest piece of real estate you could actually find. But again, hidden, you have to find it if there's a doorbell to it. And then when you go, it's like suddenly this kind of like amazing, massive Earth piece in a really small gallery space. It's pretty remarkable. Amato Opera. I don't know if anyone's been to Amato Opera. So this is an opera shoved into a tiny, 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 tiny storefront. So tiny that when they're actually coming out on stage, they brush past you. Like literally you get hit by people dressed like, whatever, like Madame Butterfly as they're like walking down the aisle because they have to move through the aisle. But it's an amazing example of how a business has kind of like fixed itself into this tiny space and then made a really high art experience, but doing it in this really kind of very constrained location. I put this one in because I think it's actually very much also related to what we talked about in terms of small space, which is that because of the space constraints, there are other ways people work around creating businesses and experiences in New York. And this is a thing, it's a little hard to understand, but we call it network of development. And one of the things that we've found over time is that there are funny things that happen in places, not because of my brilliant idea, but because I met the right person at the right time, or I had exactly the right kind of space at the right moment. And they allow for things to develop that are quite organic. And so when you start looking at experiences in New York, sometimes there are places that act more like small towns in a city than act like a city itself. 2 great examples. And this is Four Course Vegan. Has anyone been to Four Course Vegan? It's in Brooklyn. It's funny. We had the most battle about whether we would put this one in because it's such a unique experience. But this is a guy who's always wanted to do a very, very, very high-end vegan restaurant. But doesn't have the money or the network to do it. And so basically, he found a friend with a loft, somebody else who could actually start supplying him with the silverware and other kinds of things. And he pulls together this dinner that happens once every Saturday night where you have to go online, ask to come, you pay $50, I think, and you basically sit at one big fold-out table in the middle of this loft, and he serves you a 4-course, phenomenal, high, like very, very, very high cuisine vegan meal. It's amazing, and it's all about him knowing the right people at the right time to get him access to what he needed to do. And what's interesting is, so much is that the case that actually goes back to the concept of shh and like not talking about things, which is that nobody wants to talk about it. He's not listed. In fact, if it just went out in the world, we don't know if he'd get arrested or not, which is why we had to deal a lot with whether or not we'd put it in the book. But it creates this really remarkable network of people and relies on a network. Freemans is another great example. Freemans, right, so everyone knows the restaurant, which was like phenomenally, is that a fire alarm or something? Or does that mean that my time's up? No, I'm joking. Is that they're going to be like, is that what it is? Someone's going to like ask me a question from the sky or something like that. Will this come back on or should I? Oh, cool, thanks. So Freemans is a great example where it started as a restaurant, but the friends who kind of worked there also were like, oh, down the block there's actually this extra piece of space. Like, what if we took it over? And someone else was like, well, I'm interested in having a suit shop. And then someone else was like, well, I want to do a barber. And by and large, it started to take over basically that whole street. It becomes like its own little village, and it's all people who know each other. Frankly, actually, the story I told you before about Breakbeat Science and BB Blessing, it's the same thing. It was Breakbeat Science used to have the whole store. They gradually couldn't afford it. Someone else was like, I want to store for clothing that I can afford. So they swapped. So suddenly they became a small leaseholder in the midst of a big store. So it's these kinds of networks that allow for really interesting experiences to happen that are actually, again, more like small towns that happen over cocktail parties than anything else. The last example from the book I thought I'd talk about is Dogs of New York City. And the reason why is because there are certain things that I think give you specific insight into the ways that people will live in a city and the kinds of things that they'll go through and the way that they actually have to kind of, in some ways, suffer. And dogs are a really great example. As you go around, you can see that so much of the world in New York has been built to make it amenable for dogs, because it's not really a place that's great for dogs, but you have doggy babysitting, you have doggy limo services, you have not just dog parks, but you have multi-tiered dog parks. So you have small dog, mid-sized dog, large-sized dog parks. I mean, basically everything's set up to make it a little more easier for people who want to live with dogs. And that tells you a lot about just how dedicated people are to live well and live in the ways they want to live in New York. This store is amazing. The reason we put it in there, Le Petit Puppy, is it's on Christopher Street. And what's funny about it is that it's a bunch of puppies in a window. Whatever, that's like, but puppies are like a transformational tonic. I mean, the moment you put like puppies someplace, it's like better than a cocktail. And literally what's amazing is you'll watch the storefront and people walk by it, see it, start to like look at the dogs, and then they start talking to each other. And literally, I've seen people pick each other up, like watching. It's like it becomes a dating spot because people like will hover by the dogs and talk about which dogs they like, and it goes out. It's amazing people watching. So much so that they've actually installed a park bench outside of it, not so you can watch the puppies because you're too far away to watch the puppies, but so you can watch the people who are watching the puppies. I really recommend it if you can see it. Go on like this weather on a Saturday afternoon, and it'll be a free-for-all. And I hate to say it, the only other thing that's close to puppies in New York is babies. And what's amazing is how much work you have to do to kind of have a baby in this city. And we call it Moms of Central Park West, but we also call it, it's basically Moms of Park Slope, frankly. It's the same thing. What's amazing is, and we heard about this from other people, they were like, you have to go look at the buggy derby in Park Slope on any Sunday. And what's really amazing is how much the stores themselves have adapted to it. So what happens when you get 3 buggies into a store is that literally it shuts the store down. I mean, you can't move anybody else. It's buggy blocking. And so there's like a gridlock of buggies that happen. And so store owners have figured out strategies. Like they'll be like, if we have 3 buggies in the store, we'll lock the front door until we can actually get 1 buggy out so that we can actually let somebody in, because otherwise we're a fire hazard. You know, it's like these really funny things. And there's all kinds of buggy parking. It's really interesting to watch the behaviors around that. I really recommend just kind of, again, going to Park Slope on a Sunday and watching buggy blocking happening. So those are a couple examples of the things that are in the book. And I think the perspective here is really about saying, what can these experiences tell us about New Yorkers and what it means in New York? And some of these things feel like you've seen them 1,000 times. Some things are somewhat new. The whole idea is to kind of basically look at things that you've seen before, but maybe look at them in different eyes. I thought I'd end by kind of just sort of talking about something that was really surprising to us. So we went out, we got a ton of press on this. By the way, when we sold this, nobody was sure they wanted to do a travel book. Chronicle wasn't that interested in it because they were like, travel books are hard things to sell. We weren't sure if there'd actually be interest. What's funny to us is like, we've already gone into second printing, like how excited people have been about it, but it actually brings a lot of questions up about travel and travel industry and travel writing. And I thought I'd just share those with you at the end as a way to kind of either provoke conversation or get you thinking. So three things that we've heard a lot. I had this really funny interview right in the beginning with a journalist who we did like 2 hours about travel writing. It was for a travel magazine. And she said, when she turned off the tape recorder, and she was like, can I ask you a really personal question? It's about me. And I was like, yeah. And she was like, do travel writers even matter anymore? Like, does anyone pay attention to us? Like, we're terrified that basically it's going to go away. And it's going to go away because of the kinds of things that, frankly, you guys are working on, or at least people that you're working with, which is that the reality is people don't necessarily look at that model anymore as the place that they get advice. And one of the things that we struggled with when we decided to do the book was how to write a book that wasn't travel writer tone. So you read these books and they're like, make sure to ask for Sammy, who's lovely, and it's like these you feel like you're like, what the hell? It's like, who lives this place? So they're like, Sammy, give me a cocktail. These really weird things. And so what we really wanted here was to get a tone that felt more human, more natural, and that's actually part of why I think there's been so much response against travel writing, is that it actually starts to feel like it's not really writing about your life. We believe that, and one of the things that led this is that there's a real market for DIY travel if we can figure out how to still capture authority. So people still want to know that it's not just some random person, hawking their own wares when they're online. So there's an interesting thing around trust that I think is interesting for you guys to think about. Same thing. Why do a book at all? I mean, literally, that was the other thing that we got, which is that you did a book that's so retro. It's like, and it was really funny because we spent so much time spent figuring out how to make a book that you could walk around the city with, and then people were like, oh, why didn't you just do it, online? And we were like, oh, why didn't we just do it online? Which basically is a big question for us as we go forward. But again, we did the book because we actually felt like we needed some authoritative way of saying, here's the tone for the concept of Eyes Open, whether we go forward in the book in the future or not. And this is actually one of my favorite things. This is actually, it was from a very, 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 very high-end travel magazine. And basically they were like, all about experience. And they're like, well, experience, it's sweeping high-end travel right now. And I was like, so can you talk about experience travel? Because when we mean experience, we're like, you can go to Whole Foods and feel like you had an experience. And they were like, well, we mean this. Does helicoptering into a Buddhist monastery for coffee count? So literally, it's really interesting to see how the notion of what an experience is and how you seek it has kind of shifted. So at the high end, it's really like, I'm not going to go to the Himalayas. I'll be in the Himalayas for a day, so I just want to make sure I can get into a real experience. So if I have to helicopter in, I'll do it. To what we're talking about is like, you can literally walk down this street out here, or frankly into this building, and find experiences that can be really quite reflective about the ways that we live and the ways, the kinds of things we have to undergo to live where we do. So it's a different take on experience, I think. And again, it's one of those things that makes me feel like there's a huge opportunity for us to think about us talking about experience, not us, IDEO, but us as people, and how you kind of get that out into the world and get people to understand what you're learning from it. Last thing, so what's next? We've done 2. We've been asked to do more. And actually what's funny is we're sort of at the point where we're trying to figure out whether we do more. We've launched a website, which is actually more theme-based than it is city-based. So the idea is let's take a theme like aging in place, or we're having one that's coming up again about children and health. And from that begin to kind of call experiences. And we're also going to be adding cities to that. What we're trying to figure out right now is whether or not, again, like I said, books matter. And so we're trying to figure out how we're going to do that and what we do. So I'd be really curious to hear if anyone has insight into that. And also any ideas around places we should be looking in New York, or any cities we should be looking at as well. With that, I'll end, I think, if that makes sense. Cool. And I'm open to questions, or I did this thing, one thing, sorry, I'm almost done, but I did a live New York Public Radio talk show about this, which was without a doubt the most terrifying thing I've ever done in my entire life, because I was like, okay, great, I'm gonna go talk about experiences that matter to New Yorkers to New Yorkers. Literally, I was sweating. I was like so afraid. And what was amazing to me is they had more calls than they'd ever had, and it was people who were like, you've got to check out this place around the corner that's owned by a grandmother. Like literally people were like rattling off experiences to go look at. So it's always fascinating for me to hear stuff to look at in the city. Cool, thanks. Any questions?
If you have questions, the mic in the center is a great place to ask.
It looks terrifying. Or you can yell it out and I can repeat it back too, if you're you're like, no. Anything? Any places? I have a question. Are you all, how many of you are New Yorkers? So quite a few. Like it's like, so dyed-in-the-wool New Yorkers as opposed to like transplants. Oh, you're like, oh. Well, I don't know. I guess once you've lived here for a while, you consider yourself a New Yorker. Sorry.
So I've got a quick question. I'm originally from New Orleans, and I'm just wondering if there's any chance that New Orleans will make the list, because we could really use it right now.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's funny. I was just back in New Orleans a couple weeks ago, actually, meeting with teachers there, just to sort of see. And it's a what's funny for me, and this is actually what's funny about a guidebook, is it's like what purpose does a guidebook serve? And so much of this is about the way people act and live. It would be a really interesting city at, frankly, a really interesting moment, because they've had to do things incredibly differently. I don't know if you've been back recently.
Yeah,
it's like,
my parents still live there, so.
yeah, I was talking to teachers who were basically saying that one of their biggest issues is all the kids who've been sent back alone. So basically now they're living in homes and building neighborhoods that are basically kid dominated. And so it's like there's really interesting other experiences that are out there that it'd be really interesting. It's one of the cities we'd love to do. I think the next two that we've talked about are San Francisco, Paris, and Los Angeles. Next three. But we don't know exactly if we'll do them. But if you have any places to look, send them to the website, and we'll post them.
Okay.
That'd be awesome.
Great,
Cool.
thanks.
That was a long walk.
I told you, it's really scary, right?
I was wondering if, when thinking about the concept for your book, you and your team thought about how people get from place to place. Because I noticed there are a lot of these secret, hidden, out-of-the-way places, and for New Yorkers, transportation, subways, walking, cabs, whatever, is a huge part of how people live.
It's actually interesting. So, there's a funny thing. When we wanted to do something that was sort of a take on the idea of books, of travel books, but wasn't necessarily a travel book, there are a few things that you have to break in order to make that convention clear, and it was really controversial. So to be utterly honest, we fought with our publishers, and we all kind of came to a happy place, a lot about the map. Right? Because basically a map is a sure way of knowing how to get to places, but for us, it was a travel book convention. And so basically if we wanted to say to people, this is not like a typical travel book, we were like, let's take the map out, although the map is the cover, so you can actually find it. But there's actually a section on how to get around, because one of the things that we think is that the way you get around a city actually affects a lot the way you see a city. So it's not just how you get places, but it's actually how you see places.
Yeah, that was...
Yeah, which is exactly right. So it's like, we did one piece of this where we just rode a subway the entire length of the city and just watched different people and coming on and leaving. And we were like, well, this could be an entry of its own. So we basically thought of it as more of a way to see as opposed to how to see. And the London book has it as well, because it's really different if you take bus versus black car versus walking on foot. It's really important, I think. Cool. Hey.
I had a request for a city too, which would be Tokyo, if you can ever get to it.
Yeah.
The reason for that is if you have you been?
Yeah.
So like half of the stuff is hidden in office buildings.
Yeah.
And if you don't read Japanese, it's impossible to know what's like on the 7th floor is this amazing restaurant.
Totally.
I would really like that.
Yeah, Tokyo. I mean, Tokyo is definitely on our list for exactly that reason. It's like one of those kind of. I mean, New York has that too, where it's like you realize there's like a 3rd floor city that people don't even ever see, but it's like, but there it's crazy.
Yeah, it's really hard to get around without something like this.
Yeah.
So my question is, and I think you may have partially answered it. The website, it's open for people to put in suggestions and ideas and all that?
It is. So the way it works right now is that we basically, so we had a big, I mean, these are just interesting things I think for you guys in the business that you're in, which is that we decided we didn't want to do just a free post-it blog space where people were just kind of, because we wanted to have some ability to say, oh, this is good, this isn't, or, I know like it's kind of have some quality control. So we did it by themes. So, and the idea is that there's an editor who basically reviews stuff and then posts things. And then we're going to be adding city pages. So if you have things that are city-based or theme-based, send them in. And we post most everything unless it's just like, something that everybody's seen or there's not that much interesting about it. But
Have you
please.
had good response so far?
We've had surprisingly good response, actually. It's like we're still trying to figure out how to navigate the web world at IDEO. So it's a whole new thing. And we actually we're still at the point of connecting it to our website. So it's a bunch of stuff. So right now it's an independent link. But check it out.
All right, we'll do. Thank you.
Cool. Oh. I think she has to go in order for you to get to it. Are you going to ask your question together? Oh, no, okay. It's a line.
I thought it was really interesting what you were saying about this secretive kind of maybe quasi-elite attitude that New Yorkers have to their environment. And I think I've definitely remarked on that, like, I think Yelp, for example, is much more big in like San Francisco versus New York, which could just be because it started out there or something. But I think that kind of might reflect this desire for people to keep things a little on the down low. So I thought that was a really interesting point you brought up. But then it's an interesting contrast also to, I went to Trader Joe's, the new one in Brooklyn over the weekend that like just opened. And everyone was just so happy. I feel like part of it was like being happy amongst lots of other people who are also happy about the same thing.
Yeah.
So I wonder, like, where do you think this attitude comes from, and like, how do you think it changes in a big environment where people can't actually all partake of something at
Well,
the same time?
It's actually really interesting. There's a whole other theme that we talked about, because we sort of saw these themes as contrasts with each other. Because I mean, this one is about secretiveness. Some of it's about elitism, and some of it's actually about a perception of protectiveness. You know, it's like basically, and we heard it as, there's a funny chronology that people tell you, and I think it might be in the book, but it's one of my favorite. It's my favorite conventions that people use in New York. They'll be like, it was very private, nobody knew about it, and it was very local, and then somebody found out about it and printed it somewhere, and then the models came, and then when the models came, it destroyed it, and then now it's like whatever. I mean, literally, at some point people are like, and then the models came, and it's like, boom, which is actually really funny to see. But so it's actually, I think there's a protective quality, not just an elitist quality. But the other side of it is that New Yorkers find ways to share unusual spaces and are very generous with it. One of my favorite things in the book, again, is this thing, Fulton Ferry Landing, which is basically the place in Brooklyn where you look back on the Brooklyn Bridge and on Manhattan. And we happened to be there on a day where we witnessed a friendly battle between tourists, a wedding party, and skate punks, all of whom wanted to have photographs of themselves doing, well, whether they were like jumping on their skateboard or exchanging vows underneath the Brooklyn Bridge. And it's like they were able to work it out. I mean, there was a hardcore conversation between the bride and like the guy who had the camera for the skate punk group, and like literally they worked it out, and eventually they were like, okay, you can have it for these 20 minutes, and then we'll have it. And so you have to figure out how to negotiate that way and then just enjoy the kind of publicness of places, and it's fascinating to see, I think. So.
Hi, thanks for coming. My question has to do with the relationship between IDEO, the company, and the book. What's the connection? And I've noticed that there have been quite a few of these, and
yeah.
I'm wondering if you could tell us about
Well, I mean, there's a bunch of thinking around this, which is that in a way, this is actually one of the more mass books that we've done. It's actually kind of it's far more open and public. But I think that for us, it was a point where we got to this tipping point where people were asking us so much. We're like, wouldn't it be interesting to talk to the public and see what happened? And actually it has been, because what it's meant is that we've had a more direct access from the world. Like people have started contacting us in a different way about like just things they're interested in, that we're really interested in opening up those kinds of dialogues. And I think the other side is that, I think I can say this if this is going to go out to the world, but it's like, we wonder about ourselves sometimes as a content provider, not just as a kind of consultancy. It's like we do so much content, and the question for us is like, how does that get out? And how can we, look at other people's content providers? So I think it's actually an experiment for us. And that's why I kind of say, we don't know if there'll be more books, or if there'll be a website, or if it'll go away, or we don't really know. We're just trying to see what it means in the world right now. So it's an experiment, or a prototype.
Thanks.
Which book came first? Was it London or was it New York?
So it's interesting, and I would only ever do it this way. We did them simultaneously.
Interesting. And why those two cities? I'm wondering because you're San Francisco based,
right.
And then also just in doing those two books, do you see similarities? Like what made you pick the two, especially when you said simultaneously?
Yeah.
That gets me to think, did you, come to it already with a sense that they're similar in some ways? Were you looking for something and then...
So
it's like a whole bunch of questions.
Yeah, but it's a really great question. So we didn't start with this. We had another prototype, which was actually Chicago, just because that's where we'd done the research for it originally, like for the book we took to the publisher. Interestingly, this ended up not being a bad thing, but our publisher was like, you have to do New York and London first. Like those are the cities that basically everyone starts with if they start a travel series. So it was actually a constraint that was placed on us, and we weren't also sure that was actually a right move, because frankly, we have a New York location now. We didn't when we took the book on, so it's like we weren't even sure we could, understand the market well enough or understand the place well enough. But we decided to do it, and it was the best thing we could do, because New York and London are places where if you close your eyes, you know what it looks like, you know what it acts like, you know what you think it is. And so for us, it meant we had to challenge that to see it, right? So we had to say, let's put aside everything about that and then rediscover. And if we rediscover things that people already know, great. Or if we rediscover new things, that helps. Also because in your mind's eye, London and New York probably share some kind of similarities. They're international cities, they're quite dense, they have like certain kinds of like, you have maybe certain kinds of feels, or at least emotionally you might imagine them in similar ways. They're dead different similar problems like density issues, they deal with it in different ways. So having comparative cities helps you see just how different one thing is from another, and so it actually helps you see the themes a little easier. So yeah, actually when we talk, we think a lot about Paris and LA together because actually they're both really broad cities. They're really expansive cities. They spread out, but the way they respond to spreading out, really different. And so what we think is you might see different kinds of contrasts if you do that.
And are you still considering Chicago?
Chicago, we would definitely like to do actually, and then I mean literally there's a list of 12 that we'd like to do. Tokyo is definitely on there. Paris, Los Angeles, San Francisco, a bunch. So cool.
I'm not here to end things. I actually just have a question.
Oh, okay.
So you mentioned the map kind of as an artifact of travel books from the past, and I'm curious whether there were other things that you and your team identified as artifacts that either needed to be jettisoned or just rethought for either a travel book or even just a book about place.
Yeah. No, I think that's actually, so map was a really big one. Tone, again, which I talked about earlier, which is that it's like how you talk about something that's authorial without being too authoritative was actually a big conversation for us. Organization, the way we organized it, because it's actually organized again by the ways you might want to see the cities. One of the things that I love, it was the hardest part of the book that, but still is my favorite, is, and this is actually why it starts to say, well, why a book? Like, would you do something else? Is this kind of cross-referencing? So what we did is like for every entry at the top, there's something else in the book that you might want to look at, or sometimes outside the book. So it's a way of saying, oh, if you want to see something that's more like this, go look at this place or think about that. And so that kind of cross-referencing was actually something that we felt like was a real difficult thing, or a convention that we had to break. The biggest convention, though, too, were completeness. So the feeling that it had to have everything, that's a travel book convention. Like it's basically, if you're going to be a rough guide to New York is going to give you all the places within this certain kind of, price range. So that was a big thing for us. And the other idea is, and we're still dealing with this, is up-to-dateness. So our idea is that you do one, and it doesn't matter if you ever do more. So already a few of these places have closed. So Florent, which is right around the corner, which by the way, a phenomenal insight into a neighborhood, how a neighborhood grew, and then what's happening to that neighborhood, right? I mean, Florent, basically you could tell this whole history of Manhattan, in the story of what happened with Florent. But it's like, that's closed. And so the first thing happens is our editor's like, what do we want to do? And we're like, we talk about the fact that things will close, and this is about ways of seeing, not necessarily like the things to see. So look for that in this. So that's another big convention. We most likely won't do another New York book if we do another book. We'll have addendums online, but we won't work hard to make sure this is always up to date and complete. I mean, honestly, we had a question almost, now I think about it, like so many conventions of travel books because our editors were asking that continually, so we'd had to think about why we were doing things or not. Cool. Anything else? It was really interesting, actually. It was really interesting for me, so I really appreciate you having me this afternoon. And everyone who's who hasn't got a book, buy them. Make your friends buy them. I'm sorry, you have to say that. I think. At the end.
Are you in town for other?
Yeah, I'm actually. I was here this morning. I was meeting with Parsons in the new school. So it's and then I fly out to London. So I just came through for a one-day quick meeting. So, but.
This is all you're doing now? These travel books, or you must get?
No. This is my night job.
It's my night job.
Yeah, literally from 5 to 7 in the morning, I would be writing, and the way we did it is we actually did intensive. We gathered and then we did intensive 2-week stints in the cities, and then edited and then sent people out to rephotograph. All the photographs are our own. Part of the reason for that is that we believe that photographing is seeing. It's another way of understanding something. So we decided we had to have our own photographs as a part of it. So it was pretty labor intensive, but fun. Cool. Right on.
All right.
Thanks.